On a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, everything seemed ordinary. Passengers were settling into their seats, preparing for their hours-long journey across the country. Among them was a well-dressed black man, who appeared calm and collected. He had an air of quiet confidence about him, not drawing too much attention to himself. No one knew that this man wasn't just any passenger. He was the CEO of the airline itself. But for now, he was just another face in the crowd, ready to sit back and relax during his flight. As the plane ascended and the flight attendants began their rounds, the crew went about their usual tasks. The stewardess, a woman in her mid-30s, was briskly making her way down the aisle. She was focused on getting the drink cart ready, serving passengers with the typical efficiency expected of a flight attendant. When she reached the black man, she barely spared him a glance. The stewardess noticed his calm demeanor and, perhaps unknowingly, dismissed him as just another regular traveler. She offered him a drink, a simple gesture that was supposed to make the flight more comfortable. The man ordered a juice, which seemed an innocuous choice to her. She handed it to him with a slight smirk, clearly not expecting anything out of the ordinary. In that moment, she might have assumed he was just another business-class passenger, someone who would quietly take their drink and not cause any trouble. What she didn't know was that this was far from an ordinary flight for the man, and she had no idea who he really was. As the man reached for the drink, something strange happened. The stewardess, either out of carelessness or an unspoken bias, somehow misjudged the moment. The cup, as if it were an accident waiting to happen, tipped over in her hand, spilling juice all over his lap. In an instant, the juice soaked through his clothes, and the stewardess acted as though it were just a minor mistake, brushing it off with a casual apology. But the words she said next were even more disturbing. She muttered something about him getting too comfortable and not being aware of his surroundings. Her tone was dismissive, as if this was some kind of joke, completely oblivious to the fact that her actions were crossing a line. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple accident. It was an intentional act that reflected a deeper attitude she didn't realize she was displaying. The man, however, did not react. His calmness in the face of this insult was striking, and he simply wiped the juice from his lap as the stewardess walked away. For a moment, it might have seemed like nothing more than an awkward encounter between a flight attendant and a passenger. But to the man, this was much more than that. He knew he had been wronged, and yet he remained silent, choosing not to make a scene in the middle of the flight. After all, he was used to controlling his emotions and making calculated decisions. But inside, the disrespect lingered. As the stewardess continued her rounds, the man silently processed what had happened. He knew he couldn't let it slide, but he also didn't want to escalate things in the heat of the moment. As the flight continued, other passengers went about their business, unaware of the tension that had just unfolded. For the man, the journey had taken a turn. What was meant to be an uneventful flight had now turned into something more personal. The stewardess, meanwhile, likely thought little of it, assuming her actions would have no serious consequences. She would soon find out how wrong she was. The man was not just another passenger. He was the airline's CEO, and this incident would not go unnoticed. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, the stewardess carried on with her duties, completely unaware of the storm she had unknowingly triggered. She moved from one passenger to the next, serving drinks and snacks with the same nonchalant attitude. To her, the spill on the black man's lap was just a minor accident, a small mistake that anyone could make. But for him, it was far more than just a spilled drink. It was an affront to his dignity. The stewardess had been careless, and her words, laced with an unsettling tone, only made the situation worse. She had assumed something about him based on his appearance, something that reflected a bias she likely hadn't even recognized in herself. Perhaps she had seen him as just another regular passenger who wouldn't make waves, someone she could dismiss without consequence. But what she didn't know was that the man she had just insulted wasn't someone who would tolerate such disrespect. He was the CEO of the airline, the very airline whose plane they were on. The man sat quietly in his seat, stewing over what had just happened. His mind worked quickly, calculating the best way to handle this situation. He could feel the weight of the incident on his shoulders, knowing that he would need to act. But how? He didn't want to create a scene, especially not in front of the other passengers. But he also couldn't let the stewardess's actions slide. This wasn't just a matter of personal offense. It was about setting the right example for the company he led and for everyone else on that flight. As the minutes ticked by, the man remained composed, allowing the stewardess and the flight crew to continue their rounds. He could sense the underlying tension that now hung in the air. He knew that, in the grand scheme of things, this was a small incident. But in a way, it symbolized something much bigger, a reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice and bias could be, even in places that were supposed to be welcoming and professional. The man began to wonder if the stewardess's actions were part of a larger pattern of behavior within the airline. Finally, the flight landed in Los Angeles. As the plane began to taxi to the gate, the CEO's mind was already at work. He had made up his mind. He would not let this go. He would take action, but it would be done in a way that would ensure the issue was dealt with fairly and professionally. He was no stranger to difficult decisions, and he knew this was one that couldn't be ignored. He had to act quickly, but first, he decided to gather his thoughts. As passengers disembarked from the plane, the man remained seated for a moment longer. He glanced over at the stewardess, who was busy helping other passengers get their belongings and preparing for the next leg of her shift. He took note of her behavior, her calm demeanor, as though nothing had happened. The man's mind was already working on a plan, but before he could make his move, he needed to ensure that the airline's HR team was brought into the fold. With the stewardess none the wiser about who he truly was, the man left the plane with a quiet resolve. He knew the wheels were about to be set in motion, and that the stewardess's actions would not go unnoticed. The days ahead would reveal just how far her behavior had crossed the line, and how the airline would have to address it. As the CEO disembarked the plane and made his way through the airport, he couldn't shake the frustration he felt over the incident. It wasn't just about the spilled juice, but the attitude behind it. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the stewardess had treated him. She had been dismissive, and her words had cut deeper than she probably realized. He had been calm, composed, but inside, he was seething with a sense of injustice. He knew he had to do something about it, not just for himself, but for the larger issue of how people were treated based on their race or appearance. By the time he had left the terminal and made his way to his office, his mind was already racing. The incident was not something he could simply forget. It was more than just one flight, one stewardess. It was a reminder that no matter how far society had come, prejudice and bias still existed in places people often didn't expect. He had to address it, not only to set the record straight, but also to ensure that it didn't happen again to anyone else. Later that afternoon, the CEO made a call to the airline's human resources department. He didn't reveal his identity right away. Instead, he started with a simple request. He wanted to report an incident involving one of the flight attendants from the morning's flight. The HR representative took the information down, asking questions to get all the details. The CEO described the stewardess's actions and the inappropriate remarks she had made, but he left out the crucial detail: his position as the CEO. He wanted the investigation to proceed without any bias or assumption about who he was. The HR team promised to look into the matter, and the CEO hung up, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew the investigation would soon take a more serious turn once they realized who he was. He hadn't done this for the drama or to make a point about his own status. His goal was simple: to ensure that the airline took issues of racism and bias seriously. As the hours passed, the CDO received a call from the head of HR. They had reviewed the complaint, and the situation was being taken seriously. The stewardess had been brought in for questioning. At first, she had seemed oblivious to the gravity of her actions. She admitted that the drink had spilled by accident, but insisted that the comment about the passenger getting too comfortable was simply a joke, nothing more. However, as HR pressed her further, they could sense something wasn't right. Her dismissal of the situation, her inability to understand how it could have been offensive, raised red flags. Meanwhile, the CEO remained silent, awaiting the outcome of the investigation. He wanted to make sure that the airline would take action, but he also knew that the stewardess needed to realize why her behavior was unacceptable. The more HR dug into the situation, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a one-off incident. The stewardess had, in fact, displayed a pattern of dismissive behavior toward passengers she deemed out of place. While all this was happening, the stewardess went about her day, unaware that her actions were being scrutinized. She continued working, serving passengers as if nothing had happened, never suspecting that the man she had so carelessly wronged was, in fact, the very person who had the power to change her career. The CEO's identity had not been revealed yet, but the HR department was starting to piece everything together. The stewardess, it seemed, had made the mistake of underestimating someone who she would soon realize was not so easily dismissed. The investigation into the stewardess's behavior was now in full swing. The CEO had carefully observed everything, keeping a close eye on how the situation unfolded. But he was also keen to ensure that the issue was handled professionally and fairly. He had reported the incident in a neutral way, not revealing his position as the airline's CEO, because he wanted the process to unfold without any special treatment. He didn't want to be seen as using his power to get quick results. He wanted the stewardess to be held accountable based on her actions, not his status. Over the next couple of days, the HR department worked diligently to investigate the incident. The stewardess had been asked to provide a detailed statement about what had happened on the flight, and her version of events was consistent, at first. She claimed that the spill had been accidental, that it was just a mistake, and that the comment she made about the passenger getting too comfortable was just meant to be light-hearted. But the more HR pressed her, the more cracks appeared in her story. She was asked about her history with passengers, especially those who didn't fit her usual expectations. As HR dug deeper, they uncovered a troubling pattern of dismissive behavior toward passengers who were perceived to be different. The stewardess had made a habit of speaking to certain customers in a condescending tone or giving them less attention than others. HR discovered several complaints from other passengers who had felt slighted by her attitude, though none had been serious enough to result in disciplinary action until now. While all of this was going on, the CEO kept his distance, remaining out of the loop as much as possible. He didn't want to influence the investigation in any way. His only involvement so far had been to file the initial complaint, but he was quietly satisfied with how things were progressing. He had always believed in fair treatment and was determined that this issue be addressed properly. He didn't want to let one bad instance of behavior define the airline. But he also knew that if nothing was done, the company would never truly progress. Meanwhile, the stewardess continued working, unaware that the HR department was carefully piecing together her history. She was still convinced that the whole thing would blow over, that the incident would be brushed aside as a simple mistake. But she didn't realize that the airline was now seeing her actions in a much different light. She had no idea that her careless behavior had now been linked to a pattern of prejudice, and that she was facing serious consequences. It wasn't until she was called in for a second meeting with HR that the full scope of the situation began to hit her. She was told that they had reviewed multiple complaints and were taking the matter seriously. HR informed her that the CEO had reported the incident and that his identity would soon be revealed. The stewardess was stunned. The man she had so casually disrespected, who she had thought was just another regular passenger, was actually the CEO of the airline. She hadn't recognized him during the flight, but now the gravity of her actions began to sink in. The news hit her hard. She tried to backtrack, to explain that her comment had been a joke and that she never meant to offend anyone. But the damage was already done. HR explained that the incident was not about one misplaced remark. It was about the pattern of behavior she had shown toward passengers who didn't meet her expectations. The company could no longer ignore it, and the consequences would be significant. The stewardess sat in stunned silence, realizing just how far she had overstepped. She had never thought her actions would have such serious repercussions. The idea that the CEO had been on her flight, that the person she had wronged was the very man who could change her life, hit her like a ton of bricks. Her career, her future, was now on the line, and all because of a moment of careless prejudice. The stewardess sat nervously in the HR office, her mind racing as she tried to process the gravity of the situation. She had thought that the incident with the black passenger was nothing more than a small mistake, a harmless slip-up that she could easily brush off. But now, in this cold, sterile meeting room, she realized how wrong she was. The airline wasn't brushing anything aside. It was taking this seriously, and her behavior had now been exposed for what it truly was. She had underestimated the power of her actions, and the consequences were beginning to unfold before her. The HR representative, who had been carefully gathering evidence, looked at her with a calm yet firm demeanor. "We've reviewed several complaints about your behavior toward passengers, and this isn't the first time your actions have raised concerns," the HR officer explained. The stewardess was taken aback. She hadn't realized her behavior had been so noticeable to others. The thought that multiple passengers had felt uncomfortable because of her was both shocking and humbling. She had always seen herself as friendly and efficient, but now she understood that her casual judgments about certain passengers, those who she thought didn't belong in business class or those who looked out of place, had been obvious and hurtful. The stewardess tried to defend herself, claiming that her comment about the black man getting too comfortable was just meant as a joke, nothing more. But the HR representative didn't seem convinced. She had heard similar justifications before, and they never held up. "It's not just about what you said," the HR representative replied, her tone steady. "It's about the overall attitude you've displayed. This kind of behavior doesn't reflect the values of our airline." It was then that the stewardess learned the full truth. The passenger she had treated so carelessly, the one she had spilled juice on, wasn't just any ordinary customer. He was the CEO of the entire airline. Her heart sank as the weight of her mistake fully sank in. She had thought he was just another passenger, someone she could dismiss with a careless comment. But in reality, he was the very person who had the authority to make decisions about her future. The shock of the realization made her feel like the ground beneath her was giving way. As she sat there, processing the news, the HR representative continued, outlining the potential consequences. "We will be conducting a full review of your actions and your history with the company," she said. "Your future with the airline will depend on the outcome of this investigation. But know this, any further incidents of discrimination will not be tolerated." The stewardess felt a mix of fear and regret. She had never expected things to escalate like this. She had made a mistake, yes, but she didn't think it would cost her everything. As the meeting came to a close, the stewardess left the HR office, her head spinning with what had just happened. She had gone from feeling confident and secure in her job to being uncertain of her future. The fact that her actions had now reached the highest level of the airline left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She couldn't stop thinking about how her life might change depending on the outcome of the investigation. Back in the CEO's office, things were moving quickly. He had been following the situation closely, although he had kept his involvement to a minimum. He didn't want to influence the process. He wanted the investigation to be thorough and impartial. But as the details continued to unfold, he realized just how serious the issue was. This wasn't just about one disrespectful flight attendant. It was about a broader culture within the airline that needed to be addressed. The CEO knew he had a responsibility to set the right example and to ensure that such behavior was never repeated, not just by this one stewardess, but by anyone working for the airline. He decided to make a statement to the company, assuring employees and passengers that the airline was committed to creating a more inclusive, respectful environment for everyone. The CEO's decision to speak out publicly showed that he wasn't just concerned about this one incident. He was committed to making real change within the organization. It was a powerful message that no one, no matter their rank or position, was above the standards of respect and professionalism that the airline aimed to uphold. The stewardess, now fully aware of the severity of the situation, would soon learn just how high the stakes had become. In the days that followed, the stewardess's life became a whirlwind of uncertainty. She couldn't stop thinking about the mistake she had made. Every time she tried to brush it off, her mind would return to the fact that she had treated the wrong person poorly, someone who held the power to completely change the course of her career. What made it even harder for her to process was the realization that she had crossed a line, not just by insulting him, but by allowing her own biases to guide her actions. She had judged him based on his appearance, assuming he was just another regular passenger, when in reality, he was the very person responsible for shaping the airline's culture and policies. The stewardess's days on the job became filled with tension. The other flight attendants knew something was wrong, but no one dared to ask her directly. The usual camaraderie among the crew was replaced with an uncomfortable silence whenever she walked into the crew room. Her colleagues could sense that something big was about to happen, and they didn't want to get caught in the middle of it. The stewardess, once confident and well-liked, now felt like an outsider. She couldn't even look her fellow employees in the eye, knowing that they were all wondering about the outcome of the investigation. Meanwhile, the CEO continued to monitor the situation from behind the scenes. He had made it clear to the HR team that he wanted a thorough investigation, but he also wanted to ensure that the stewardess was treated fairly. He didn't believe in punishing someone without giving them the chance to understand why their actions were wrong. The CEO was a firm believer in second chances, but only if the person was willing to learn and grow from their mistakes. He didn't want to fire the stewardess right away, but he knew that a simple apology wouldn't be enough to fix what had happened. He wanted to be sure that the airline would not tolerate any form of racism or discrimination, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant it might seem. The HR department had gathered all the necessary information and was preparing to make a final recommendation. They had interviewed the stewardess multiple times, and while she had apologized for her actions, her responses have been filled with regret, but not with true understanding. She seemed to grasp the severity of the situation only when the full weight of the consequences began to sink in. The CEO knew that the stewardess was remorseful, but he also understood that true change came from within. And sometimes that change required a wake-up call. Then the call came. The HR department had made its decision, and it was time to meet with the stewardess. She was asked to come in for one final conversation. The CEO, who had remained silent until now, would finally reveal his identity. He felt that this would be the moment when the stewardess could truly understand the impact of her actions. When the stewardess walked into the room, she was immediately taken aback by the sight of him. She had no idea he had been the passenger she had disrespected. The shock was evident on her face as she realized who she was speaking to. The CEO calmly addressed her. "I know you didn't recognize me on the plane, but I was the passenger you spilled juice on." His voice was steady, but there was an underlying seriousness that made her heart race. The stewardess tried to apologize again, but he stopped her. "What you did was wrong. And I know you understand that now," he said. "But the reason I'm here today isn't just to make you feel guilty. It's to help you understand why what you did is bigger than a spilled drink. It's about how our actions can hurt others, even when we don't mean to." The stewardess sat in silence, her face flushed with embarrassment. She realized that this conversation wasn't just about her job or the immediate consequences. It was about something much deeper. The CEO continued, "I don't want to punish you for making a mistake. What I want is for you to learn from this and to make sure that no one else feels the way I felt when you treated me like that." It was a turning point for the stewardess. She felt a mix of shame and gratitude, shame for what she had done, but gratitude for the opportunity to make things right. The CEO made it clear that this wasn't the end of the road for her. There would be training, lessons to learn, and a chance to prove that she could change. But he also made it clear that if anything like this happened again, there would be no second chances. The stewardess left the meeting with a heavy heart, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. She knew she had been given a rare opportunity, and she was determined not to waste it. In the weeks following the meeting, things began to change for the stewardess. The conversation she had with the CEO had left a lasting impression on her. She had spent countless hours reflecting on the words he had said, especially the part about the deeper impact her actions had on others. She had thought it was just a harmless comment and a small mistake, but now she understood it went far beyond that. It wasn't just about what she had done to the black passenger on the plane. It was about a pattern of behavior she hadn't recognized in herself. The HR department had enrolled her in several diversity and inclusion training sessions, and for the first time, the stewardess truly began to understand the gravity of her actions. The training sessions weren't easy for her. There were moments of discomfort as she learned about the biases that influenced her behavior and how her words and actions could unintentionally hurt others. She had never seen herself as prejudiced before, but the more she learned, the clearer it became that she had made assumptions based on race, appearance, and status. It was a tough pill to swallow. But the stewardess knew that if she truly wanted to change, she had to face the uncomfortable truth. Throughout this process, the CEO's message stuck with her. This was about growth and accountability, not punishment. She realized that while her actions had been wrong, they didn't define her. What mattered now was how she responded and whether she was willing to change. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to make things right. She started to approach her work with a new mindset. She made a conscious effort to treat all passengers with respect, no matter their background or appearance. It was a slow process, but she felt a shift in herself. She had learned the hard way that judgment based on appearances was not only unfair, but it could also have serious consequences. The CEO, meanwhile, was closely monitoring the progress of the stewardess. He had insisted on giving her a second chance, but he also knew that actions spoke louder than words. He was satisfied with how she was responding to the training, and the change in her behavior didn't go unnoticed by her colleagues. While some passengers still remembered the incident, many others began to see the stewardess in a new light. Her sincerity and willingness to improve earned her the respect of her fellow flight attendants, who had once been unsure about how to handle the situation. Slowly, the tension that had built up around her began to dissipate. It was a few months later when the CEO saw the stewardess again. He had been on another flight, this time under a different identity, to see how things had truly changed. As he walked down the aisle, he noticed the stewardess in action. She was smiling, speaking politely to the passengers, and moving with a calm professionalism that he hadn't seen in her before. There was no sign of the dismissive attitude that had once marked her behaviour. He watched her carefully for the rest of the flight, taking note of how she interacted with everyone. There was a marked difference in her approach, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. After the flight, he approached her quietly as she was preparing for the next leg of her shift. The stewardess was nervous at first, but when she saw him, a sense of relief washed over her. She hadn't expected this moment, but she was ready. The CEO looked at her and smiled. "I've been watching you," he said. "And I have to say, I'm impressed with the changes I've seen. You've come a long way." The stewardess felt a wave of gratitude. She had worked hard to change, and it felt good to know that her efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. She had learned that growth wasn't just about understanding others, but also about learning to see herself more clearly. She still had a long way to go, but the progress she had made so far was a step in the right direction. The CEO's words meant more than just praise. They were a reminder that change was possible, even after a mistake as serious as hers. And though the journey hadn't been easy, the stewardess knew that the lesson she had learned would stay with her for the rest of her life. From that day on, she worked to create an environment of respect for every passenger, knowing that her actions could make a lasting impact. As for the CEO, he knew that the story wasn't just about one stewardess. It was about creating a culture within the airline where everyone, no matter who they were, felt valued and respected. He was proud of the steps the company had taken to address the issue, but he knew there was still work to be done. It was a reminder that the journey toward fairness, respect, and understanding was ongoing. And with that, the CEO hoped that this experience would inspire others within the company to embrace the values of kindness and equality, making the airline a better place for both employees and passengers alike.